Alright, hopefully you have solved this problem from video 1. So starting video 2, we're going to look at the solution to this problem. In this problem, it's a little bit simpler than the last one in that this equation, or this ratio, actually only has one term on the top, and this one has two terms. So we don't have quite as much distributing as we did in the last one, but you still have to be very, very careful with this problem. So when I do the cross multiplication here, n times 6, that's simply 6n, so that one's going to be pretty easy. But be very careful with the other side. This is going to equal 5 times this entire numerator. Everything in this numerator must be multiplied by 5. So use those parentheses to make sure you don't make any mistakes. And let's actually write out this step of 5 times the quantity 2n plus 4. Now, with the 6n, there's not really anything I can do there, so I'm just going to leave that alone for now and rewrite that 6n. But on the right-hand side of this equal sign, I'm going to have to distribute. 5 times 2n gives me 10n. And then 5 times, please make sure you're multiplying and not adding, 5 times positive 4 is a positive 20. We still have variables on both sides like we did in the last problem, but this time we're going to have to do things a little bit differently. Let's try to foresee what's going to happen here. If I move this 6n over to the 10n, because it is the smaller coefficient, I'm going to be left with nothing on this side, which is 0. I would have a 0 over here. And while I can solve the equation that way, it does require more steps. So since this side of my equation does not have just a constant term, it doesn't have just a number without a variable, then I want to move everything over to this side. So instead of moving my 6n to my 10n, I'm actually going to move the 10n to the 6n. So a positive 10n, if I want to move that to the other side, the inverse is negative or minus 10n. So if I subtract 10n from the right, I have to move over to the left and subtract 10n. So 6n minus 10n, I am going to have to deal with a negative number in this problem. So I'm actually going to move my work again over here. 6n minus 10n gives me negative 4n equals, and the 10n minus 10n, that's 0, and I'm left with a positive 20. We do not have to have that plus sign there. It is understood to be a positive 20 without the sign. Now we have just a one-step equation. So the inverse of multiplying by negative 4 would be to divide both sides by negative 4. Be very careful. Make sure you carry your signs with you when you do your division. Negative 4 divided by negative 4 is a positive 1n equals, and 20 divided by negative 4 is negative 5. So you could plug negative 5 in to your equation there at the top, your proportion, and make sure that you do create equivalent ratios. And you will. So negative 5 is the answer to your turn question 3. Now let's take this solving proportions another step, and let's look at word problems where we have to actually set up our proportion first before we can ever start solving it. So my suggestion, when you get to a word problem and ask you maybe the directions say to solve this using proportions or to set up the proportions, start trying to figure out what are my ratios. So let's start reading this word problem. A portable media player has 2 gigabytes of storage and can hold about 500 songs. So what I'm seeing here, what this is telling me when I read this is that I have two different values that are comparing one to another. 2 gigabytes compared to 500 songs. I can have 500 songs if I have 2 gigabytes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this. This is my first unit of measure here, 2 gigabytes, and that is being compared to holding 500 songs. Now, if I read further, the next sentence says a similar but larger media player. So I'm actually moving away from that ratio. I'm starting with another media player. It has 80 gigabytes of storage. Okay, well, in comparison to the last sentence, I'm going to go back to my blue highlighter here. This media player has 80 gigabytes of storage. So what my brain is saying, okay, the first media player only had 2 gigabytes and held 500 songs. This one has 80 gigabytes. It's going to hold a whole lot more. And that's actually the question that they have here. How many songs? About how many songs can this larger media player hold? Well, I have gigabytes to songs. That's the ratio that I have in each one of these sentences here. So let's actually start writing these two ratios. The first one, for our first portable media player, 2 gigabytes of music, or 2 gigabytes on your media player, will give you about 500 songs. Now notice I'm not using my units for this. That way I can just compare my ratios. But 2 gigabytes yields 500 songs. So that is equal to, because we're trying to set up equivalent ratios. So we're setting up a proportion here. So we can use two different ratios, create a proportion in order to find missing pieces. So in this case, we're missing how many songs we can have with 80 gigabytes. So my second ratio here, setting up this proportion, 80 gigabytes. Now, the reason I'm putting this on the top is because my first ratio compared gigabytes to songs. So to create an equivalent, to create a proportion, I have to also have a ratio over here, gigabytes to songs. So I have to make sure that my ratios are set up the same. I don't know how many songs, so I'm going to make that X. And I have a very simple proportion now. I can use cross products to solve this and find out how many songs I can have on the larger media player. So I'm going to use cross multiplication. 2 times x, and that gives me 2x. That's very simple. And the other one, I don't have to worry about the distributive property or anything in this problem because I only have one term in each numerator and denominator. So I'm just going to simply go ahead and multiply 500 times 80. And that's going to give us 40,000. So be careful, make sure you don't lose any zeros there. 500 times 80. Now, I have a one-step equation. It's very, very simple. The inverse of dividing by 2, or multiplying by 2, is dividing by 2. Gave you the answer there. Divide both sides by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1, so I'm left with 1x equals, and 40,000 divided by 2 is 20,000. Since this is a word problem, we do need to label that this 20,000 represents songs. Make sure you have your units in there. So, if you have a media player with 80 gigabytes of storage, based on this word problem, you can have about 20,000 songs on the media player using proportions and cross multiplication to determine missing pieces in a word problem. So take what we've done here in example 4 and apply that to your turn question number 4. Alright, so hopefully you've come back from pausing the video and trying this problem. Highlighters work really well in trying to pull out the important information. That way you can see, you can use the same color for information that's the same. And so that's what I'm going to do again with this problem, like I did with the other example. First sentence tells me an 8-ounce can of orange juice contains about 97 milligrams of vitamin C. So just like in the last problem, I've got two different units that are being compared to each other. The first unit I have is ounces, an 8-ounce can of orange juice. And if you have 8 ounces of orange juice in this can, then you have about 97 milligrams of vitamin C. Alright? So if I go on and read into the next part of this word problem, which is actually the question, it asks about how many milligrams. So right up front in this question here, it asks you, it tells you what you're looking for. How many milligrams? So that's why I'm highlighting that in pink, because it's going to have to be compared or matched up with this one when I write my ratios. Now we want to know how many milligrams of vitamin C we're going to have if now we have a 12-ounce can of orange juice. So I'm going to highlight that in yellow because our ounces are going to have to make sure that they are, when we're setting up our ratios, everything has to be set up correctly. So we've got our units that we're comparing here. Let's go with the one that we know both units for, and that's from our first sentence. 8 ounces in this can will contain approximately 97 milligrams. So 8 over 97, that's our first ratio, ounces to milligrams. So if I'm going to set up a proportion to find out how many milligrams are in the other can, I have to make sure that my ratio is set up the same way, ounces to milligrams. So I do know from the question here that I have a 12-ounce can of orange juice. And what I don't know is how many milligrams. So that will be my variable. Same type of problem as the last example. Very simple. Use cross multiplication. 8 times x gives me 8x. And cross multiply the other direction. 97 times 12 gives you 1,164. Simple one-step equation, the inverse of multiplying by 8, is dividing by 8. So 8 divided by 8 gives me 1. I'm left with 1x. And that equals 1,164 divided by 8. We're going to have about 145.5, and make sure you have your units, milligrams. So if you have a 12-ounce can of orange juice, you're going to have about 145.5 milligrams. Alright, that concludes solving proportions. So I want you on your notes to answer these 3 summary questions. The first one is a very simple proportion. The second one, you've got to be very careful, distributive property. Make sure you look back at your notes. Make sure you're solving that one correctly. And then C is pulling in the word problems where you need to set up your proportion and solve it for your missing information.